Good morning, Beltsville campus online. It is a pleasure to be with you, sharing the message with you today. And we're going to be talking about this is our community. We're going to be talking about what community looks like, and a very important component of that, which is listening, the ability to listen well to others. And I'm entitling that The Adventure of Listening. Now, I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but I think it's becoming more and more common. Have you ever been talking to a friend and you're into it, you're really sharing a story or an experience or something that's important to you, and all of a sudden, your friend that's listening to you kind of goes quiet, and you feel like they've stopped listening to you. And then you look over, and this is what you happen to see, that they are engaged in something on their phone. And I don't know about you, but what happens to me is I just stop talking. And they just still stand there, and I could tell that they're just in another world until they put the phone down. As soon as they disconnect from the phone, they're back with me. But while they're on it, it's like no listening is happening. There's zero listening taking place. And so we don't want to be that kind of listener. We want to be someone who is actively listening to other people. And so we're going to start today with just a little gauge on how you would rate yourself as a listener. And so those of you who are in the chat, if you're not in the chat, go ahead and get in the chat so you can respond to my question. And you can put in the chat right now 3 options. 1, I'm a good listener most of the time. Number 2, I'm a good listener when I choose to be, but sometimes I don't choose to be. And number 3, I'm not a very good listener, but I'd like to get better. So whatever you think about yourself, your own self-evaluation, put that in the chat. And it doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter how you answered. What I'm going to share with you today will help you in any of those situations. If you're already doing great, you can just decide that to get a little bit better. If you know that you can do it, but you don't always choose to do it, then hopefully you'll be inspired to choose to use that skill more often. And finally, if you want to get better, but you're not quite sure how, hopefully I'll give you some practical tips as to how you too can listen better and engage other people. But we're going to learn from the best today. We're going to learn from Jesus how to be a good listener. And I'd invite you to turn in your Bibles to John chapter 4, and we're going to start in verses 5 through 10 from the New International Version. John chapter 4, verses 5 through 10. The Bible tells us, so he, Jesus, came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon. Now, I can picture this in my mind because 2 years ago, I went to this very location in Israel. I have seen Jacob's well with my own eyes, and that gives me kind of a beautiful context for this story. Just kind of picture kind of a barren, dry part of the country, and this well kind of in this central location, kind of a central hub for the town. Almost the modern equivalent might be something like a grocery store or a Starbucks or something like that. But this is where people came to get their water, kind of the hub of the town, very important to the life of that city. And so it was noon when a Samaritan woman came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" His disciples had gone into town to buy the food. And the Samaritan woman said to him, "You are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink? For Jews do not associate with Samaritans." And Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." Interesting dialogue starting off right here at the beginning of our message today. We see Jesus, and he's showing us principle number one of how to listen to others, and that is we need to start a conversation. Jesus engages the woman. Now, he's not afraid of the cultural taboos. He's not afraid of crossing some of those types of lines, because when he looks at the woman, he sees a child of God. He doesn't see a label. He doesn't put a judgmental label on her forehead. He could have put the label Samaritan, woman, and either of those labels would have been enough that any other Jewish man would have felt completely justified to ignore her, to have no conversation. Oh, Samaritan woman, I don't have to engage. I'm out. But instead, Jesus starts a conversation. He's not worried about whether the conversation will be awkward or not. Sometimes I think many of us, myself included, avoid conversation simply because we're worried that it might enter into some kind of awkward territory. What if I say something that I shouldn't? What if I mess this up? What if I offend the person unintentionally? But those are all excuses to just avoid the conversation. But Jesus doesn't make any of those excuses. He engages the conversation because he sees a child of God. He sees someone that needs the living water that he has to offer. And so he starts a conversation. And so that is always step one of listening well, is to start a conversation. So simple application right off the bat. If you're like, man, how can I get better at listening? Just try it this week. Start a conversation with someone else. See what happens. See where it takes you. Ask them an open-ended question. How are you doing? Ask them, what are some things that are challenging you in your life right now? What are some things that are going well for you? Just general questions. Just try to get the person talking and see where it takes you. And then Jesus listens without judgment. How do we know he's listening without judgment? Because if he was being judgmental, he wouldn't have even started the conversation in the first place. Oh, Samaritan, oh, woman, nope, done. No conversation, I've already judged you. No, he's curious, he's interested about who this person is that's in front of him. And so he starts the conversation. He engages the conversation, listens without judgment. And then as he's listening, he hears what isn't being said. And that's another level of being a good listener. Sometimes I get caught up in the content of what's being said. And I take the content sometimes way too literally. When sometimes somebody might say something and they're saying it more as an exaggeration because they're expressing emotion. I'll give you an example of that. So say someone says to me, you know, I've had the worst week of my life this week. Now my content-oriented brain might say to myself, is this really their worst week? You know, I mean, they have some other weeks they've told me about that, I'm sure. I mean, if you really put it on a rating scale, it's probably worse than what they're actually going through now. And I might, if I'm really off and not being careful, I might launch into that and start engaging the content level and ask them, you know, are you sure, is this really your worst week? And I'm debating the logic of their statement. But what am I missing? What's not being said, but is, if I have ears to hear it, is the emotion. I'm exhausted. I've had it rough this week. It's been so bad, my mind is calling it my worst week ever. And if I'm listening to what's not being said, I might ask a better follow-up question, or I might offer a reflection of something like, this sounds like it's been a really difficult, challenging, painful week for you. Is that right? Are you feeling drained by what you're going through? And I could check in on what the person is feeling to hear what's not being said, to check in and connect emotionally and not just at the level of content. And so we see Jesus, he's hearing what isn't being said in this conversation with the woman. Let's look at that as we go further in verses 15 through 19 here of John chapter 4. Also in the NIV version. The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water." And he told her, "Go call your husband and come back." "I have no husband," she said. Jesus said to her, "You're right when you say you have no husband. The fact is you've had 5 husbands, and the man you are now with is not your husband. What you have just said is quite true." "Sir," the woman said, "I can see that you are a prophet." And so we see here that Jesus can see between the lines. He sees the thirst that this woman has to feel loved, to feel accepted, to take a drink of that living water. And so he offers it to her. And then he finishes by helping the woman listen to herself. He says, "You're right. You have no husband, but you've had 5. You've been on this quest. You've been looking for something, and everything you've tried hasn't worked yet." And so he helps the woman start to admit to herself that her life isn't working the way that she wants it to. That there's an emptiness, there's a dissatisfaction that she's feeling with her life. And that's really step 2 now of our adventure of listening. And step 2 is where we learn to listen effectively to ourselves. And this might be maybe the scariest part of the adventure. Excuse me. And it could also be the one that maybe we avoid the most. Because when we really listen to ourselves, it can lead us to make effective changes in our life. But that can be scary when we think about listening to what's in our hearts. So think for just a moment about some of the desires and dreams that are in your heart. And start with the good ones. Start with the things that you know, that you feel good about. You know, like these are good desires. These are good dreams. Like I want to be more like Jesus. There you go. There's nothing wrong with that. I want to be a better husband and father. I want to be a better mother and spouse. I want to treat my children better. I want to be a better friend to my friends. I want to get in better shape physically. I want to do a better job at work. All of those types of desires, nothing's wrong with that. You know those are good. But there may be some desires in there that aren't as noble, that aren't as good. Maybe you have a desire for revenge. There's someone that's hurt you, and you want to let them have it in return. And that feels uncomfortable to admit that to yourself. Maybe there's a desire, maybe you're feeling exhausted with work, and you just have this fantasy and this desire of like, what if I could just do nothing for a whole week and still get paid? Wouldn't that be wonderful? And it's kind of embarrassing to admit that and say, man, I don't want to be thought of as a lazy person. And so some of the things, when we listen to ourselves, might end up being uncomfortable. But here's the thing, here's the advantage. When we put things out on the table and we're honest with ourselves about what we're feeling, about what we desire, about what we want God to do in our lives, when we're honest, we're much less likely to just mindlessly and compulsively act on some of those desires. And so if the desire, when we put it on the table, if we look at it and say, that's self-destructive, or that would really be harmful to other people, when we could see it, then we can evaluate it before we take a harmful action. Let me tell you about the story of my friend Jason. And that's not his real name. I've used that name to protect his identity, his story. And this story took place many years ago, before I moved here to this church. But Jason was going through a hard time. And I remember him kind of confessing to me one day that his dream was to run away from it all, quit his job, and just go raise sheep in the country. So Jason he just wanted to get away from it all. But sadly, Jason never really processed what was going on with him. And slowly, he began to take actions that were self-destructive and harmful to those he loved. He started to take painkillers addictively, became addicted to Oxycontin, and it began to affect the way he looked at life, the way he viewed the world. Eventually, it caused him to have an affair, divorce his wife, move away from his children, quit his job. Like many things in his life just kind of all fell apart. And it wasn't because he had these desires in his heart. It was because he didn't listen to himself. He didn't face the desires that were in his heart. He didn't put them out on the table where he could pray through it, where he could talk to someone else about it and kind of work through what was going on with him. And so as he shoved the desires down, they came out sideways. They came out in self-destructive, painful, brutal ways that caused his life to kind of all fall apart. And so the importance of listening to what God is putting in our hearts, of putting it out on the table, is that then we can look and we can pray through it and we can say, God, where's the healthy desire in some of these that are more embarrassing, that are more destructive? Where's the healthy sense of that desire? If you look at Jason's story, he wants to run away from it all and just raise sheep. He's feeling overwhelmed by life. The healthy desire there was that he desired simplicity. And there's a healthy way to get that without throwing away everything in your life. You can find simplicity in your current job, possibly, in your current relationships. You don't have to do something crazy or drastic. And there were many other healthy desires that Jason was feeling, but didn't quite know how to navigate. And so when we listen to ourselves, we are in a place to better make decisions, healthy, wise decisions that God wants us to make when we can look at it and put it out on the table. And finally, and I already mentioned this, but the final piece of good listening is to also listen to God. Because when we listen to ourselves, we're asking God for wisdom as what to do with that. And when we listen clearly to God and what God is telling us, then we are ready to do the next right thing and without worrying about the outcomes. So we're going to make the next right choice and let the chips fall where they may. We don't get caught up in the outcomes. Sometimes when we worry too much about the outcomes, about the final result, how is this going to work out? How is this going to work? It prevents us from the other two stages of listening. It prevents us from being willing to engage another person. If I start the conversation with someone else, I don't know where that may lead. And so because of my fear of the outcomes, I do what I can control. And I know that if I avoid the conversation, then I'll be in control. Then life will be safe and normal. And so I can just leave it the way it is. But God calls us to trust Him and let the outcomes be what they will. And so He calls us into the adventure of listening. Let's go back here to the text where we see what happens when Jesus, letting go of outcomes, enters into this adventurous listening interaction with this woman at the well. Verses 27 through 30 of John 4, it says, "Just then his disciples returned and were surprised to find him talking with a woman. But no one asked, 'What do you want?' or 'Why are you talking with her?' Then, leaving her water jar, the woman went back to the town and said to the people, 'Come see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Messiah?' They came out of the town and made their way toward him." And so what you see here is we see that Jesus models this behavior. He engages the conversation with a woman and lets go of the outcomes. He's not worried about what his disciples will think. He knows they don't get it. They don't, "What are you doing, Jesus? A Samaritan woman?" He's not worried about that. He's focused on this child of God that he cares about, and he's letting go of the outcomes. And guess what happens? As he listens to God and engages the woman right there at the well, he sees this as a divine appointment set up by his Father. He engages her in conversation. He offers her the living water. She is thirsty for that water. She accepts the offer, gets so excited that she leaves her jar at the well and rushes back. Now, that jar is a symbol of her attempts to find fulfillment in life on her own. And she doesn't need it anymore because she has the living water inside of her. And she runs away. And guess what? She's not worried about outcomes anymore either. When she gets to the town, she says, "Come meet a man that told me everything that I did." Now, she's not worried about the fact that this is making her look bad. People are focusing on her somewhat sullied reputation in the community, and she doesn't care at all because she's found Jesus, and she's trusting Him, and so she's just letting go of those outcomes. She's not airbrushing her Instagram photos, trying to make them look perfect, only sharing the stories in social media that make her look good, make her look like her life is all together. She's not worried about that anymore. She's letting it all go. Just trusting God with the outcomes of her life. And so she shares the good news of this living water with her town, and they all come out to see Jesus. Now, here's the thing. Jesus starts a conversation that leads him to this opportunity to address the entire town. But he doesn't know when he starts the conversation where it's all going to lead. He just engages and leaves the outcomes to his Father. Sometimes when Jesus engaged a conversation, it didn't lead to this kind of fruit in his ministry. And that was okay too. We can't judge the process by the outcomes. Sometimes the outcomes are great. Sometimes they're not as good. But when we're following Jesus, it's the process that counts. We do the next right thing, and then we trust the outcomes to God. Now, we've just finished last month celebrating Black History Month. And it was a delight to be able to do that together, to shine a spotlight on some of the inspirational stories of Black African Americans in this country. And so I can't resist sharing a story that still inspires me to this day, and that's the story of Rosa Parks. And Rosa Parks got up one day, and she was listening to herself. She was listening to the tiredness within. She was sick and tired of the racism that she had to endure, being put in the less desirable seats on the bus. And finally, one day, in exhaustion, listening to that voice, she sits down. And there's a detail of the story that I just discovered as I revisited it. She actually sat initially where she was supposed to. So they had kind of created a line in the bus, and she sat behind the line where she was supposed to. But then some other passengers got on the bus, some white passengers, and the bus driver said, "Oh, we're moving the line, so ma'am, you need to stand up and move farther back." And Rosa Parks in that moment listened to herself. She listened to her own exhaustion. She also listened to God because she knew this was wrong. She knew deep in her soul that this was immoral. And she just said, "No, I'm not going to move." And the bus driver started to threaten her with arrest and this and that. And she just let go of outcomes. She said to him, "You may do that if you wish." And the next thing you know, she ended up arrested, in jail. But a whole nation was inspired by her story, and we continue to tell her story to this day. And I promise you, when she took that action, she had no idea what the far-reaching outcomes would be. She had no idea how many people would tell her story for generations to come. She just did the next right thing and let the outcomes be what they were. She trusted the outcomes to God. And that's the beautiful thing that happens when we start to listen to God. When we listen to God, we can trust that if we do the next right thing, that God has everything else taken care of. And sometimes we're going to get outcomes that we're excited about, and sometimes we're going to get some challenges that come from it. I mean, Rosa Parks did the right thing, but ended up in prison. That couldn't have been easy. But even though she was in prison, her soul was free because she knew she had done the right thing. And so I would much rather have external challenges and know in my heart that I was doing the right thing than to have a life of ease and to know in my heart that I was doing the wrong thing. And so she listened to God, let go of the outcomes, and God saw her through that. God used her doing the next right thing to inspire others. And this, in turn, brings us full circle on the adventure of listening, because when we are willing to listen to God and trust the outcomes with Him, that gives us the courage to start the conversation with somebody else. And when we're listening to ourselves and our own dreams and desires and putting those out on the table and recognizing that some of them, there's a healthy desire within it, but some pieces of it need to be sorted through and sifted through and sorted out. When we're in tune with that, we can be in tune with the desires of someone else. We can listen to what's not being said. We can listen between the lines for the emotion, for the deeper story, for the more important story that's being told. That's exactly what Jesus did with this woman. He heard her more important story, and he offered her something better, the living water. And so when we enter into this adventure of listening, we listen to what's really going on with someone else. We hear their story and we allow it to take us into new territory. And while we're listening, we're hearing, we're paying attention to what's happening inside of us. And we're listening to that, and we're listening to God in the whole process. It all comes together. It's all interwoven together as we embark on this adventure. And so I just want to challenge you this week. I want to leave you with just some very tangible things that you can do to put this message into practice, to follow the example of Jesus that we read about today in John chapter 4. And it's very simple. And you can start wherever you want, because wherever you start, it will affect the other two principles. So you could start by engaging someone in a conversation this week. Think of somebody that you haven't connected with, maybe at all, maybe just not recently. It could be someone you're close to. It could be someone you don't know that well, maybe a coworker at work, and decide that you will get to know them a little better this week, that you will start the conversation. And maybe it will be a comfortable conversation. Maybe it won't be. Maybe it'll be a little uncomfortable. Either way, it doesn't matter. Just start the conversation. So that's one step that you can take. And some of you are going to take that application. You're going to take that next step this week. But others of you may decide, this week, I'm going to listen to myself. I'm going to listen to what's going on in my own heart. I'm going to put that on the table. I'm going to maybe discuss that with someone else. I'm going to be in tune with what God has placed on my heart. And I'm going to sort through that so that what's going on inside of me does not prevent me from hearing what other people are trying to tell me. And so when we're in tune with our own heart, we're a much better listener for other people. So that's another place that you could start. And then number 3, some of you are going to start this process by listening to God. You're going to have some quiet time where you really ask God to speak to you, to push you out of your comfort zone so that you can ask God to put someone on your heart that you need to engage more this week. Someone that maybe needs the living water of a relationship with God. Someone that you just could connect to a little more. And as you pray through that, as you listen to God, then you can take action based on what God places upon your heart this week. So I've given you 3 options, 3 potential next steps that you could take this week to enter into the adventure of listening. And whatever option you take, please make sure that you let go of the outcomes. Don't try to control everything. Don't try to control all the outcomes. That will just get you stuck. You'll never do it. You'll never take any of these steps if you try to control all the outcomes. Just trust God with the outcomes, take a risk, and see what happens this week. Let's pray together. Jesus, you showed us the way. You showed us how to have this adventurous life of listening to others, to ourselves, and to you. And so as we go about our lives this week, as we take our next step this week, we trust you with all of the outcomes. We let go of all of those. And we ask that you would lead us, that you would guide us, that you would fill us with your living water, that we might share that with others as we engage them, as we listen to them, as we care about them. So go with us this week, Jesus, as we place our lives in your hands. For we ask this in your name. Amen.